So this is chapter 15, Thinking in the Brain, and I've excluded I've excluded 3 of the sections, 4, 5, and 6, for the sake of brevity. I think a lot of the materials that were in those sections we did touch on in previous sections of the book, but by all means, read those sections if you are interested. So the nature of thoughts. This chapter, I think, ended up being a bit of a catch-all, just covering a lot of topics that didn't necessarily fit in other sections. So it's going to jump around a little bit, but there's definitely some interesting material. Psychological constructs. A construct in psychology is idea that a mental ability is an actual entity. So the idea that like memory is actually a thing, or language or emotion. Before we knew about brain systems, we had all these kind of folk psychology terms for things. And the more we move into brain systems, some of those constructs in psychology are being reinforced by brain areas that are dedicated to those, brain areas and systems that are dedicated to those functions, whereas other psychological constructs we're not finding to be explicitly represented in the brain as well. We don't always have consistent definitions of psychology constructs, which makes psychobiology really complicated, because if we can't define the construct, it's hard to say where it's represented in the brain. So for example, thought is a difficult construct to pin down. In fact, many people wouldn't use that term in psychobiology because it's so vague. A thought can mean something that you're aware of. A thought can be unconscious or conscious, depending on how you define it. It can cover a lot. It can be a very specific thing as well. Similarly, like intelligence, there's a lot of controversy over how intelligence should actually be defined, and a range of other constructs in psychology as well. There are some characteristics of human thought that we have observed. One is that it appears to be mostly verbal. This is very interesting. So one suggestion for why babies and very young children don't form explicit memories is that they don't have language yet, and the way that we actually think in language even if we're not fully aware of it. Language allows us to organize time and ourselves. Kids self-talk a lot when they're young, so you might see a little kid when they're playing. If she's working with her blocks, she might talk to herself and say, stack this block on top of this block. Kids talk to themselves a lot more, which eventually turns into subverting self-talk. So as we get older, we stop talking to ourselves. But a lot of that self-talk is still happening in our thoughts. Borrowing from the field of schizophrenia research, this is actually likely where like command hallucinations, which is hallucinations where a voice is telling somebody to do something. This is actually just a misinterpretation of self-talk. Actually, we kind of verbally command ourselves to do things a lot, but we're not aware of it. We're not consciously aware of a lot of our self-talk and how verbal a lot of our thought processes are. Syntax, which we talked about how syntax is innate and it supports this ability to organize our thoughts. The caveat is that we have to learn language in order for our innate syntax to emerge and help us organize our thoughts. So if someone did not learn language by the critical period by around 6 years old, they won't have that innate syntax emerging, and they won't be able to organize their thoughts based on language. Another characteristic of human thought is that the human brain wants to make meaning out of its surroundings. It's constantly trying to make meaning. One kind of consequence of this may be this déjà vu, which is this feeling that you've done or heard something before, but you can't quite place it. And this actually might be an example of kind of spurious attempts of the brain to create connections. Our brain is always trying to create connections. So you might occasionally have this feeling of having experienced an exact moment previously. And thinking is likely interaction, however we define it. It's probably interactions between many different brain systems. There's no one thinking region of the brain. Association cortices are something we didn't get to talk a lot about. They were mentioned kind of briefly in several chapters, especially the sensory chapters. But these are neocortices outside of the primary sensory and motor areas. So there's the motor association cortex and the sensory association cortex, visual association, etc. Input to the association cortices comes from parts of the thalamus that also receive information from other cortical areas. So association cortices may be integrating sensory information with higher level information, other cortical areas. In addition, we didn't get to talk much about the anterior cingulate cortex, which is this pretty interesting medial part of the cortex. Some people consider it part of the frontal lobe, some people don't, but it has creates connections between emotional systems and cognition, and has a lot of interesting functions that we don't have time to get into right now. But it does seem to be another area that kind of creates a connection between other functions. Multisensory integration is another interesting area that we didn't get to talk about. So our brain integrates information from different areas really quickly and effectively, to the extent that we don't really know how to explain it, and this is called the binding problem, explaining how our brain is able to integrate information so quickly and effectively. We understand a lot of the more basic processing better, but we don't understand the really higher order processing. Possibly multimodal regions of association cortices could be involved in multisensory integration and the binding problem. Multimodal regions integrate information from more than one sensory modality, so integrating information from visual and auditory systems, for example. We don't have a good map of this in the brain, but there's this image from a monkey brain of some areas where it's been noted that more than one sensory modality is being processed in that area, at least sometimes. Many of you might have heard of synesthesia. Some people are synesthesiacs, which means that when one sensory modality is stimulated, it automatically stimulates another. So I think one of the more common ones is grapheme color synesthesia, in which an individual, if they see a letter, specific letters and specific numbers each have their own color. So S's in this example are always this fuchsia color, A's are always this dark red. Numbers are like the 1 is always a teal color, for example, and it's kind of like automatically processed this way. There's indication that this may result because of cross-activation of the color and grapheme areas in the brain. They're pretty close to each other, grapheme being symbols like numbers and letters. They're close together, and so in some people's brain, these may get activated at the same time. There's a number of types of synesthesia, and it's really interesting. I recommend reading more about it or checking out YouTube videos about people who have it if you're interested. But there's another type called mirror touch synesthesia, where a person feels sensation that they observe in another person. And this is might be related to empathy, but it more typically occurs in people who have other types of synesthesia as well. Attention is a cognitive function we also did not get to talk about. Attention is when the focus of awareness is the ability to focus awareness to internal or external stimuli. So you can focus your attention inward to try to get a memory, to try to think about something, to try to plan or decide. You can also focus attention externally to something in your environment if you want to focus on your computer screen, for example. It can be influenced by factors in the environment as well as internal influences. So in our environment, there are certain things that naturally catch our attention. If there's movement in our environment, in an otherwise still environment, this automatically catches our attention. Novel stimuli, things we don't recognize. If we're sitting in a classroom and been sitting in the classroom with the same people every week, and there's a new person suddenly, this person is more likely to attract our attention, kind of naturally and almost against our against our will. Internal motivation is another way of internally allocating attention. So if we have an internal motivation, if there's a book we really, really want to read, this is kind of like an intrinsic motivation to focus our attention on the book. To the right, these dot pictures, this is just an example of how certain novel stimuli are likely, or novel meaning like new or different stimuli, are more likely to attract our attention. So in the image where it's all green and there's one red dot, you can't help but look at the dot. It's almost impossible to ignore that dot. Whereas in the right panel, where there's many different colors, you actually kind of have to try to find the red dot because there's many novel stimuli, or it's not that different. And this is called the pop-out effect. When there's one thing that's quite different, it grabs our attention. Attention has pretty complex neural underpinnings. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as well as frontal eye fields, which are just a little bit anterior to the DL-PFC, are implicated in attention, but a number of other brain areas are as well. Ultimately, stimuli are fighting for our attention, so stimuli in the environment and also internal stimuli are constantly engaged in a competition to be present in our conscious awareness. Okay, so moving on to section 3, expanding the frontiers of cognitive neuroscience. I picked out, I didn't include most of the information from the section, but I thought social neuroscience is very interesting. And this is the study, of course, of social functions and social phenomena in the brain. Theory of mind is a theory I mentioned in a previous lecture. So it's the ability to attribute mental states to other people. People with autism tend to be poor at this. They're not able to guess what another person is thinking, and difficult to understand complex social interactions. And there are specific neural areas that are associated in theory of mind. One is the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Another is the temporal lobe, temporal pole, and then another part of the temporal sulcus. The sense of self, or understanding of oneself, is also, of course, represented in the brain. There are many areas of the brain that code for different types of sense of self, because there's actually many components of having a sense of self. There's a physical sense of self, sense of owning your body, sense of controlling your own actions. It's actually a really complex construct. But some of the main areas in the brain that have been associated are represented by these colored rectangles in the midline structures of this brain. So some frontal regions and then parietal regions as well. And then finally, there's this one area of the brain in this represented in this spinning brain, the little red dot, is out-of-body experiences are in the temporal parietal junction. So this is the connection between feeling like you're embodied within your body. So out-of-body experience is something people sometimes have when they're on the verge of dying, or it can actually be stimulated. It can be stimulated by TMSing the temporoparietal junction, but it feels, some people have felt that they're in an out-of-body experience. It feels like your soul, for lack of a better word, is exiting your body. It feels like you no longer inhabit your body. And that is a rather specific area of the brain. Okay, so the last section of the class is consciousness, and this is really complex. The neural substrates of consciousness and the neural underpinnings of consciousness are, it's one of the most complex areas of neuroscience in general, but part of this is because consciousness itself is a very complex construct. It's been defined in many different ways. Your book defines it as the mind's level of responsiveness to impressions made by the senses, and I think this is a very neuroscience-based definition of consciousness. Other people define it as the ability to think derived from the ability to feel, or the awareness of one's own existence. Some people say it's whatever, take animal cognition and subtract from human cognition, and whatever's left over is consciousness. Notably, many people in psychology don't like the term consciousness and don't believe that it's a meaningful term or a meaningful construct. People have told me that it's a 4-letter word in psychology. But there are scientists who have attempted to study consciousness in the brain and have come up with some pretty interesting results. So this individual, Christoph Koch, he's one of the most well-known researchers of consciousness, and he's a really unusual guy with an affinity for pink. He had his hair dyed pink for some reason for a really long time, and he forces his lab to wear these unusual red vests because he's obsessed with color, but he's all over just a really unusual guy. But I recommend, if you're interested in the neurobiology of consciousness, I recommend looking up. I'm sure he has TED Talks. But Christoph Koch has studied the neurobiology of consciousness throughout his entire career, and he believes that there's this area called the colostrum, which is the most likely candidate for as a neural substrate of unified experience and the regulation of consciousness and cognition. He believes that it might use synchronized neural oscillatory activity to unify brain areas. So neural oscillatory activity is when lots of neurons fire together, and this can happen across a range of brain regions, and they fire together just like in sleep waves. We talked about oscillatory activity, the alpha waves and the beta waves, things like that. So fire together, and this may be a way of sort of unifying areas, activating areas of the brain simultaneously. There's also, as I mentioned in the optional readings for this section, there's a recent article by Christoph Koch's group where they recently found neurons in the mouse brain that are encircling the entire brain. So it's really, for the central nervous system, a really long neuron. So for interneurons, it's a really long neuron, and appears to have connections within quite a lot of different areas of the brain. And Christoph Koch's group thinks this may be somehow related to consciousness and with unifying different areas and functions of the brain.